good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the National Book Festival so far. And as you can tell, and there is a line of people outside, because this great conversation for you today is very, very timely, I think, as we navigate through historic and world events. So I'm honored and wanted to get up here and do this to welcome to the 2024 National Book Festival, Mr. Stuart E. Eizenstat, the author of The Age of Diplomacy. And you may clap right now and say something. Because when we talk about experts who were really in the room where it happened at crucial moments that affect us all, Stuart was someone who was there. He's an international lawyer who served as ambassador to the European Union and deputy secretary of both the Treasury and State Departments. He's the author of President Carter, The White House Years and the Future of the Jews, among other titles, and he will be in conversation with one of our favorites, Douglas Brinkley. He's yes, go on. He is a professor of history at Rice University, presidential historian for the New York Historical Society, trustee of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and a frequent and wonderful commentator on CBS News, MSNBC, and CNN. He's also the author of numerous books of history and history makers like Rosa Parks, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and much more. So now I'm getting off the stage so you can hear the conversation.
Thank you. What a wonderful audience you have, and getting introduced by Carla Hayden, the great head of our Library of Congress and the National Book Festival. Thank you, Carla, for coming here for us. I've known Stuart for a while, and The Art of Diplomacy is really a must-read book. Particularly, you're going to see when we get into issues of Ukraine and Gaza, Israel, NATO, and all anchored around what is the art of negotiation and diplomacy. So let's begin, Stuart. Tell me what, the simplest of questions for the first, what drove you to write this book?
Well, let me first thank Dr. Hayden for her leadership of the library, for making it more accessible to the public, digitizing things, reaching underserved communities. And Doug, you and I have many overlaps. Atlanta, you've written a book about President Carter, and I have as well, and many other books that you've written on Jean Monnet and Dean Acheson have overlaps with my career. So I wrote the book for three reasons. The first is, we are in a period which is highly turbulent and which there seem to be insoluble problems. And I wanted to demonstrate by using 12 examples for the past 50 years of how equally seemingly insoluble problems actually were solved, to give people confidence that we can solve the ones we have now. Second, we are in the midst of two hot wars at the same time in Gaza and Ukraine, the possibility of conflict in Taiwan. We've all lived through multiple wars, from Vietnam to, in the Balkans, Bosnia and Kosovo, the two Iraq wars, Afghanistan, and Libya, with very mixed results. And so I wrote this book also to look at when, how, and whether U.S. military force can be used as an adjunct and supplement to diplomacy. And third, and I think our election this year will be an example of this, there is a growing isolationism in this country, an unwillingness to engage internationally. And I wrote the book because I wanted to demonstrate how critically important U.S. leadership is in the world, and that without it, we will leave a vacuum that the Russias and Chinas and others with very different values and interests will fill. So those were the really three reasons why I ended up interviewing over 130 people leading generals in the wars and the key negotiators in these major negotiations.
Before we get to our current times, 2024, let me just ask you about a couple of people. Henry Kissinger, what can we learn from Kissinger's diplomacy?
So Kissinger wrote the foreword to the book, one of the last things he wrote before he passed away. And there are a number of things. There are 3 negotiations which I focus on in the Kissinger chapter. One is the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Sinai in part in 1973 after the Yom Kippur War. Second is the opening to China. And third is the peace agreement with Vietnam. And what we can learn from him is his capacity to put himself in the shoes of the other side, to come up with creative solutions. So to give you an example, Israel was on its heels in the surprise attack in 1973 on Yom Kippur. It then counter-forced and pushed the Egyptians back into Sinai and had the Egyptian Third Army totally surrounded. It could have destroyed the main body. And Kissinger came to Golda Meir, the prime minister, and said, "Madam Prime Minister, you may think that if you destroy the Third Army, you're going to achieve a victory. It will be a Pyrrhic victory. You need to give Sadat some humility, some understanding with his own people, or he'll never make peace with you in the future." And it was that allowed her to release the stranglehold, gave Sadat at least something to take home to his people, and I believe was a key factor several years later in President Carter's negotiation with Sadat and Begin of the peace agreement. It was that ability to do it. In addition, when he negotiated the opening to China, he realized that the Chinese tradition was not to go immediately, as you would with the Soviet Union, to a fixed agenda. Zhou Enlao wanted to show him around the Forbidden City, talk about Chinese culture, Chinese history, and he was a Europeanist. That was his background at Harvard as a teacher. But he prepared intensely for the negotiations, so he understood the Chinese mindset going in. What did they need? And one of the attributes of a great negotiator, and in a way, this is the way we negotiate with our children, with our spouses, with our business colleagues, but it's critically important in international negotiations. And that is, Doug, the ability to put yourself in the other party's shoes, to understand what they need. It's not a poker game where it's winner take all. They've got to have something to come home to their constituents, and Kissinger was quite brilliant at that.
It's like why we left Emperor Hirohito in Japan after World War II.
Exactly.
To at least have the Japanese have something to return to. You mentioned Sadat and your closeness to Jimmy Carter. Sadat died because of the Camp David peace accord. He was assassinated. What was the relationship like between Jimmy Carter and Anwar Sadat? And what role did Carter play? How important was Carter at Camp David?
So one of the attributes of a great negotiator is courage. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to break from established positions. And that's what Sadat did. Just think, there had been 4 wars between Israel and Egypt. And all of a sudden, he decides he's going to go to Jerusalem and he's going to say, no more wars. He lost his foreign minister over that trip, and he lost his second foreign minister at Camp David, who actually resigned in the midst of the discussions, because he was willing to break from the established mold. That is also critically important in another example that I've used, and that is in Northern Ireland. You had a 100-year dispute between Ireland and Great Britain over the future of Northern Ireland, and a 20-year conflict, which the British, in typical understatement, called the Troubles. Well, the Troubles were a civil war that killed 3,500 people and maimed tens of thousands of others. But here again, courage. The leaders of the Catholic and Protestant communities ultimately said, Doug, we've had enough. We've got to find a way out of this solution. And they were willing, in effect, to break from their own constituencies, to show that kind of courage. So courage is also an critical attribute. Now, at Camp David, this is, in my estimation, and I don't think it's being hyperbolic, the greatest single act of presidential diplomacy in American history. For 13 days and nights, Jimmy Carter himself drafted 22 peace agreements and shuttled between Sadat's cabin and Begin's cabin, and when he found Begin to be very difficult, he went around him to his aides, and he showed a personal relationship. So you mentioned, how did he win over Sadat? He had Sadat come several months before to Camp David to get a sense of what Sadat needed to establish a personal relationship. And then on the first Sunday at Camp David, in his presidential limousine, he took Prime Minister Begin and President Sadat to the nearby Gettysburg battlefield to demonstrate to them the futility of more war. And there, two very interesting things happened. The first was, Sadat was a general. He had actually studied in some of the war colleges here, and he talked, somewhat to Carter's embarrassment as a Southerner, of the mistakes that the Southern forces made in the Pickett's Charge. Begin was not a military strategist, but on the spot, verbatim, literally without a note, he gave Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And that kind of personal relationship was important. He had a Shabbat dinner, all kosher, by the way, at Camp David, and spent several hours at a Shabbat dinner with them to, again, try to break the ice. So in these kinds of negotiations, you've got to try to find ways to personalize, to identify with the person. Jim Baker did a great job of that with Foreign Minister Shevardnadze from the Soviet Union on German reunification. Just think about it. Put yourself in Shevardnadze's shoes. They lost 20 million people to the Germans in World War II. And here, the wall has fallen to their great embarrassment. Communism is crumbling. And the United States, with Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush, a very underrated president, are telling them we need not only German reunification of the East and West, but German reunification within NATO. Now, one of the ways he was able to do that is establish a personal relationship with Shevardnadze by taking him out to his retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And for 2 days, talked about their families, about the importance of peace, about a new era. And that helped break the ice and allowed Shevardnadze to overcome the opposition of his own foreign ministry. So these kinds of personal relationships are critical. One last thing which I want to emphasize, to go back to Camp David. So we're at the 13th day. It's a Sunday. Everybody agreed. If we couldn't reach an agreement there, that's the end of it. Begin comes to the president's cabin, and he says, Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. Please get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting. I can't do anything more. Well, Carter realizes that if Sadat goes home empty-handed after the courage he showed in going to Jerusalem, he could be assassinated right then. And his own administration would be at risk. So he remembered, because of preparation from the CIA reports, that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. So he has his secretary, Susan Cloud, get 8 copies of the original photo taken the first day of the 3 of them, gets the names of each of his grandchildren, and then pens their names with Hope for Peace, Jimmy Carter, and goes to Begin's cabin and hands him the 8 photos. And Begin goes through each one, vocalizes the names of his grandchildren. He sees Begin's eyes tear and his lips quiver. Begin puts his bags down and he says, I'll make one last try. That personalization was critical to separate what is now a historic agreement that's lasted through thick and thin, including the Gaza War, and failure.
How important is the relationship between a Secretary of State and the President? You look at Truman Atchison's closeness. You're talking about the closeness of Baker and 41. Today you have Biden and Blinken. does it need to come from the State Department or the NSC? How do our adversary knows that what you're talking about broader is going to be the voice of the sitting president?
Well, this is really critical. You have to know when you're negotiating, and the other side has to know that what you're saying is going to be accepted by the president. And there are secretaries of state, like William Rogers, for example, who did not have the confidence of the president. Kissinger ended up becoming National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, ending that problem. Secretary Vance, Secretary of State under Carter, was a good Secretary of State, but they did not have that kind of close relationship that Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, does. So that's really absolutely critical. And flipping it the other way, one of the failures we had, and I write about the failures too, is when we were negotiating the hostage deal with Iran, with Jimmy Carter, which ended up costing him, I think, his presidency. We actually had several agreements with the Iranian government representatives. They were going to release the hostages to the foreign ministry and to a UN commission, and that was going to be the way of getting out of this. What we didn't realize is that those negotiators didn't really have the final say-so. It was Ayatollah Khomeini. So we were negotiating with people who really couldn't speak for the supreme leader. So it's not only your own administration where that's critical, but you have to know that the person you're negotiating with has the capacity to deliver their own government, or it's futile. And it's one of the reasons we had 444 days before we could reach an agreement.
Beyond reading your book, The Art of Diplomacy, what books on diplomacy, peacemaking, have you read in your life that had influenced you?
Well, Kissinger's own book, called Diplomacy, is a very important book. It talks about how he negotiated. Martin Indyk did a wonderful book on Kissinger and his negotiations in the Middle East. And let me give you an example, too, of what I mean by courage. Ehud Barak was the most, and is, to this day, the most decorated Israeli soldier ever. He was the chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces and then became prime minister. And Martin Indyk describes in his book a really, and I interviewed Ehud Barak, a really critical issue. So Assad, the president of Syria, the father of the current president, was very ill, knew he was dying, and wanted to solve the Golan Heights issue that had come from 67 and the 73 war. And he actually instructed his foreign minister to come to Washington to meet with the 22 ambassadors from the Arab League to tell them that he was going to make peace. He was willing to have a token international force overlooking the northern part of Israel, but otherwise he was going to normalize relations. And Barak, who was extraordinarily courageous on the battlefield, saw polls showing that that was unpopular with the Israeli public and wasn't willing to take it on. So you have to show sometimes courage in the negotiating table, not just on the battlefield.
When do you know when to break down peace talks? For example, you're mentioning Syria. Warren Christopher, as Clinton's Secretary of State, I believe went, it might be one number off, but like 27 times to Syria to negotiate with Assad, and nothing deeply fruitful comes out of it. Is there, do you know the moment, James Baker moment, like close the book, walk? How does a diplomat or a peace negotiator know when the moment is that it's no longer showing the grandkids, it's no longer finding common ground?
So Warren Christopher was Deputy Secretary of State in the Carter administration, Secretary of State with Clinton, a very good friend of mine. But when it came, for example, to the war in Bosnia, which was brutal, you had the Srebrenica massacre, when he made his rounds to Europe, all the Europeans said, I don't really think he's speaking for the president. And it took Richard Holbrooke at Dayton to finally do that. So you have to have someone who has got the president's ear, who's willing to make the tough choices, and then convince the president and his White House team that this is the time to really strike while the iron is hot. It's really critical. You have to have the sensitivity of knowing when is the other side really saying this is my bottom line, or is it just a talking point? What is the real bottom line? And is it a bottom line you can accept? Because at the end of the day, you have to be able, for the United States of America, to be able to accept their bottom line.
I'm going to ask one more history question and then turn to our times right now. And we could talk all day about Jimmy Carter, who will be 100 years old, October 1st. So we can all wish him a happy birthday. But you also know and worked with Bill Clinton. What is it about Bill Clinton you admire as a two-term president?
So Bill Clinton was willing to take really tough positions. For example, on Northern Ireland, one of the things that really broke the ice, and talking about courage, is he invited Jerry Adams, the head of Sinn Féin, which had a relationship with the terrorist group, the IRA. He gave him a visa to come to the United States, and that was wildly unpopular. John Major, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, wouldn't talk to Clinton for a week. He said, "You're getting involved in my politics. Northern Ireland is not yours." But Jerry Adams said that gave him the credibility when he went back to convince the IRA it was time to lay down arms, to negotiate a settlement rather than to try to do it by force. I would like to mention one other thing because it's really so important. And that is, we tend to be, and I'm going to make this statement, the United States is in some respects unreliable when it comes to many negotiations. And here's what I mean by that. Let's take climate change. I have a whole chapter on climate change. I led the Kyoto negotiations in 1998 on climate change. Our position on climate change depends entirely on who wins the next election. With George H.W. Bush, we initially got in, then out. Every time a Republican comes in, we pull out. Every time a Democrat wins, we go back. How can you negotiate? How can you tell China and other countries, you need to do more to reduce your emissions, when they say, well, wait a minute, we don't know where you're going to be 3 months from now when your election happens? Second, it's very important for presidents to honor agreements that their predecessors have made. And I've worked in 6 administrations. There's always an instinct for the new president to say, I got elected by the American people, I'm better than the guy I just defeated or who I'm succeeding, and the hell with what he did. So let's take 2 examples. Ronald Reagan, to his credit, after he blasted our SALT II treaty on nuclear arms with Soviets during the 1980 campaign, then honored it for 7 years as president, because he realized it represented a presidential commitment, even though the Senate hadn't done it. Contrast that with the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement in 2015 with Iran. With all of its imperfections, it boxed Iran in for 15 years. It reduced their centrifuges. It ended their plutonium plant. It had 24/7 inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And what did President Trump do? He came in and he walked away from the agreement. And now we're in a situation where Iran, which then had 2.5% enrichment, way below military means, is now at 60%, and within weeks can go to military grade. So it's very important to have continuity, Doug, between administrations, and not just say, well, I beat this guy, and so I'm going to vitiate what he's done.
If you were a young person, either in the audience or watching, on television. You want to get into the world of diplomacy, public affairs, international affairs. What's the best way to enter that world? Through what educational paths should people look at, or is it just depends?
Well, there are several ways. First of all, although I'm not a Foreign Service officer, in the State Department, when I was Undersecretary of State and Ambassador to EU, I worked with the Foreign Service. They're extraordinary. So going into the Foreign Service is one way. Second is your path or the NGO path, work for a think tank, work for a university, write, get known as an expert, and then your expertise will be asked for by presidents. And third is frankly just good luck. I mean, get attached to a president who's got a chance of winning. Now with Jimmy Carter, after Harvard Law School, I worked a year in the Johnson White House, then on the Humphrey campaign. When he lost, I went back to Atlanta, clerked for a federal judge, and went straight to Carl Sanders, who was the former governor of Georgia, was going to run, was the prohibitive favorite. And a high school classmate of mine, Henry Bauer, said, there's this young state senator, Jimmy Carter, he's an underdog, at least see him. And that was transformative for my life. Not because he was likely to win, but because I saw something in him. Not that I saw him as president at that time, but he was from South Georgia. He believed in civil rights. He believed in mass transit for Atlanta. I saw him as someone who could unify the state. And by attaching myself to his wagon, even though he was the underdog, one thing led to another, including the White House. So get involved in political affairs, get involved and don't always pick the one who's the prohibitive favorite. Pick the one who most appeals to you and who you think represents what you believe in.
Now, the last time I did a public event with you was at a synagogue in Houston, and you're a man of faith, and you've been a great educator on the Holocaust to people, and you know Israel well. Where were you on October 7th when the Hamas attacked, and how did you reflect back to that moment when you were watching and learning, and what's your journey been since then as the Gaza-Israel war continues?
So I want to say, Doug, in answer to this, leaders make a difference. I remember exactly where I was in my own residence in Brussels in 1995 as ambassador to the EU from the US when Rabin was assassinated. Had he lived, I'm absolutely convinced we would not be in the mess we're in now. He had the confidence of the public. He made a very interesting statement. He was criticized for negotiating with the PLO. And he said in his very gruff words, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. He had that capacity.
Yep.
Now, where we're at now is in Gaza, we have a situation in which I think Hamas has to be dismantled as a governing and military force because no country, certainly Israel, but no country can have a government on its border which is not only committed to its destruction, but has the capacity for it. But, and this is really critical, this can't be solved only militarily. It has to have a diplomatic component as well. And Israel's real security, in my estimation, and I've been there 50 times, I had a think tank with Dennis Ross, who's been a great negotiator in Jerusalem. Israel's greatest security will come by being embedded into a moderate Sunni Arab coalition with countries, most of whom it already has peace agreements with Egypt, with Jordan, with Bahrain, with the UAE, with Morocco. And we were within, when I say we, the Biden administration, within weeks of having a Saudi-Israel normalization. That's why October 7th happened. Without question, that's why it happened, because Hamas and Iran couldn't tolerate that. But Israel's real security comes in being embedded in that kind of coalition against Iran's axis of resistance, with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with Syria, with its own militias in Iraq. The condition, however, for Israel to be in that coalition, and indeed the condition to restructure the governance of Gaza and to rebuild this, and I want to give you an example, please let me, on Gaza. I've been there and I want to tell you about it. And this is what all the moderate Arab countries are saying, there's got to be some perspective for sovereignty for the Palestinians. That's their condition. This government in Israel is not willing to do that. And by the way, neither is large parts of the Israeli public, even the left, because of the shock of October 7th. So you have to start building confidence up. Now let me show you what could happen. I'm going to give you a real live example. Okay, July 2000, I'm now Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. I'm responsible for the economic dimension of the peace process. I go to Gaza, and we had gotten Congress to pass something called qualifying industrial zone legislation, which meant that any country at that time, like Egypt, like Jordan, or the Palestinian Authority, which had a peace agreement with Israel, could create an industrial park, and if they had as little as 10% Israeli content in a company's product, they could ship back without any tariffs to the United States. And what I saw in Gaza, now I'm talking about July 2000, okay? I'm not talking about some other millennium. July 2000 was beautiful. 30 plants, not Israeli plants, Japanese plants, Singapore plants, European plants, American plants, using things like unprocessed Israeli cotton. And the Palestinian workers, 1,200 are employed. 1,200 are employed in these 30 plants. And they were building the foundations for the next. It was beautiful. We had unemployment down to 14% in Gaza and 8% in the West Bank. And I went into one of these plants, and I saw the products being loaded on a flatbed truck going through the crossing, now the Eretz crossing, which we read about in the paper, going to the airport that we built, your taxpayers, the Corps of Engineers, for the Palestinians so they could export their products, cut flowers and strawberries and things like that, and light apparels. One unarmed Israeli soldier was there. July of 2000. 2005, a right-wing but reformed Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, pulls out every single Israeli soldier, every single one, and 7,000 Israeli settlers forcibly. We should show these videos of the soldiers pulling the people out. There wasn't one Israeli left in Gaza. They left the greenhouses, they left the light industry like I saw, so the Palestinians could rebuild their economy. That was 2005, 2006. Hamas wins the election. They take over in 2007, and instead of sending roses, rockets come. This is before October 7th. So there is the possibility of peace if we can get the right partners together. I saw it with my own eyes.
Is the two-state solution still on, you thinking, the wise route, or do we have to reconfigure that in lieu of what's happening over there now?
In my opinion, again, and I spent a lot of time in Israel, it's not popular among the Israeli public. 60% pre-October 7th supported it. 25% do now because of the shock. They say, well, any Palestinian state's going to be a Hamas state. I don't believe that's true if you can build in the right security to it. So I think, Doug, it is the only solution, but you can't leap right to it. So let me again go back to some of the lessons. If I can use a baseball term, if you swing for a home run, you're going to strike out a lot of times in negotiations. You have to go for singles. What do I mean by that? So 2 examples. Camp David, which I've already mentioned. Camp David solved the problem between Egypt and Israel, but not the Palestinians. There were no Palestinians at Camp David, 0. And I can tell you that Jimmy Carter did backflips to try to get Arafat to accept UN Resolution 242, which was land for peace, so he could participate, and he refused. So we didn't have that opportunity. In 2000, President Clinton, Prime Minister Barack, and Yasser Arafat at Camp David II, 95%, the Clinton parameters, 95% of the West Bank was going to be given back to the Palestinians for a state. East Jerusalem was going to be the capital. Rejected. Second Intifada happens. 2009, Prime Minister Olmert to Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority. 96% of the West Bank. The other 4% to be made up of Israeli territory from the Sinai. East Jerusalem is the capital. 50,000 Palestinians allowed to come back into Israel. Rejected. So with the parties so far apart, you've got to build in smaller singles, economic things that can begin to build confidence back so we can get to a 2-state solution.
We are going to take questions, so if anybody has them, I'm asking one more, but please feel free to line up at a microphone here, and we'll be able to do it for about 10 minutes, I think. I just don't want to not mention Ukraine, so my final question, what's your view, what's going on there, and how much difference will it make for Ukraine whether former President Trump or Kamala Harris is elected?
So a couple of things on Ukraine. First of all, it makes the point that I was making about the lack of reliability because foreign policy has become so polarized, like domestic policy. So when other side, like Putin, sees a substantial minority of the House hold up for 6 months aid to Ukraine, Putin says, well, time's on my side. I've got the leverage, and leverage is critical in negotiations. Why should I do anything now when I may get a president who will cut all arms off for Ukraine? Now, Henry Kissinger made the point in my interview that you can't win on the negotiating table what you don't win on the battlefield. Let me say that again. You can't win in the negotiating room what you don't win on the battlefield. That's why it's so important that we arm Ukraine and give it the opportunity to get back as much territory as possible. But, and this is a critical but, I believe there won't be a formal peace treaty. I believe what there will be is something like the 1953 armistice agreement that solved the Korean War. That's lasted for 70 years with no war and no peace treaty. There's a demilitarized zone. Everybody knows who controls which side, and I think that's what's going to happen. Russia will control some, I hope as little as possible. Ukraine will control the rest, and there'll be a demilitarized zone. Now, here's what's critical. Number one, we cannot negotiate behind Zelensky's back. We did that in Vietnam, and with all of Kissinger's greatness, he negotiated the Vietnam peace agreement without Saigon being present. We negotiated in the Trump administration and then into the Biden administration an agreement with Taliban without the government of Afghanistan being present. And then we said, oh my God, they all fell apart when we left. Well, they weren't even part of the negotiations. So we can't negotiate behind his back. And last point, and really, really critical on Ukraine, and that is, in order, let's put yourself in Zelensky's position, okay? The whole West goes and says, all right, it's time for this war to end. You're not going to achieve anything more on the battlefield. And Putin realizes the same thing. Okay, so Zelensky says, well, wait a minute. You're asking me to enter a negotiation with Putin? Let me give you 2 examples. You know, there's an old adage, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we've twice been fooled by Putin. 1994, the Budapest Memorandum. Putin gets Ukraine to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a commitment not to invade any more of Ukraine, which he violates by taking Crimea. Second time, in the so-called Minsk agreements in 2014, 2015, when the so-called little green men from Russia came and started the war in the Donbass area where it's happening now. We, the United States, and the UK, and Russia, and Ukraine, signed the Budapest Memorandum, and what did it say? It said Putin will not get any more territory from Ukraine. And then in 2022, 2 days before he attacks Kyiv, he says, Doug, publicly, Minsk is no more. And what do? Nothing. We finally give some arms. We had given assurance. So Zelensky's going to say, well, wait a minute, you want me to have another ceasefire, another armistice with this guy? What assurance do I have? Well, one assurance is making a member of the EU. Second is leaving some NATO trainers there. Third is the eventual acceptance in NATO, but at least in the EU, it will be more difficult, I think, for Putin to do. And last is reaching, as Biden did, a long-term defense agreement with Ukraine. So we know, but that will depend again on the next presidential election.
Very good. Well, let's start with the questions. Yes, sir.
You've been at the table or in the room for an awful lot for the last 25, 30 years, whatever. My question is, what kind of influence is a president of the United States really have in terms of what the Prime Minister of Israel does? Because, and the reason I bring that point is, right now we've sent a whole armada of our finest people, and certainly aircraft carriers and all this stuff, and they're all sitting there waiting for Iran to throw stuff so they can not shoot it out of the sky. Will there be U.S. casualties on that? Maybe. So it's just kind of like.
It's a good question. So let me be very frank about it. You know, Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House when we were in the White House with Carter, once said all politics is local. And for the Prime Minister of Israel, all politics is local. So do we have an influence on Israel? Of course we do. We were able to reach the first stage of a hostage agreement. We've been able to get presidents over the years have negotiated Camp David, they've negotiated a Jordan agreement, they've negotiated with Trump the Abraham Accords. So presidents do have an influence, but at the end of the day, an Israeli prime minister is going to do what he thinks is best for his own political survival. And that unfortunately clashes with what Hamas does. I mean, I make a big point in the book that you have to start with the right negotiator at the right time. But you can have the best negotiator in the world. If the two parties have diametrically opposite views, it's very hard to get an agreement. So Hamas wants as its bottom line to stay in power and to keep its military force. And Israel wants exactly the opposite. So when you have those polar opposites, plus a very conservative Israeli government, which is dependent on two very right-wing ministers, it's very hard for the U.S. president to be able to push against that domestic policy.
Thank you. Thank you. In the sense of fairness, we're running out of time, but so if you can ask, you've been patient, to just ask a quick question, and we'll get, and so I can bring you in also, and then we'll wrap.
Okay. As someone who was on the last plane out of Kandahar and then spent my time looking at Chinese economic aggression in Africa, my question is two-part, answer either one. One, do you think we've positioned ourselves to be able to negotiate because we've prepared ourselves militarily for potential invasion of Taiwan? And secondly, have we positioned ourselves to counter Chinese economic aggression both in ASEAN and throughout sub-Saharan Africa?
So I'm really concerned that we are dealing with Chinese influence in Asia with one hand tied behind our back. One of the things we have to bring to the table is access to our market. And we had a trans-Pacific partnership with 11 Indo-Pacific countries that we backed away from because there's such a protectionist mood now. And so China has filled that vacuum. They've got their own trade agreement with much lower standards for in fact, no standards for environment or human rights or labor rights. And so we're fighting them one hand behind our back. Number two, ambiguity is often critical in negotiations. Not specifying exactly what happens if China goes after Taiwan. We left that ambiguous. What we didn't leave ambiguous is that we would provide arms for them, which we've done. Now, Biden has 3 times said we would defend Taiwan if they're invaded. And each time the White House has pulled back and said, no, we're going back to the original Kissinger formula, which was ambiguous about what we would do. That ambiguity can be very, very useful. Now, I was involved with the first normalization. Richard Nixon and Kissinger deserve all the credit for opening to China, but they didn't normalize relations because there was a Taiwan lobby that was very important in the Republican Party. We did in the Carter administration. And so, just to give you a humorous anecdote, Deng Xiaoping comes to the White House, all 4'11" of them, and I remember seeing him saying, how does this little guy control 1 billion Chinese? So he comes into the cabinet room, and he thanks the president for this historic effort to normalize relations, the first time since the end of World War II. And he says, what I really need is I need most favored nation tariff treatment so I can rebuild our economy. And he takes a little white notepad, White House, Washington, with a pencil and pushes it over to Carter. And he says, now I know that there is a Jackson-Vanik amendment which bars giving that favorable tariff treatment to any country which limits its immigration. But he says to the president, that was aimed at the Soviet Union, which was barring Soviet Jews, not us. And then he says, Mr. President, I want you to put on this piece of paper the number of Chinese you'd like us to send you each year, 1 million, 10 million, 20 million. So Carter says, I'll tell you what, we'll reach a deal right now. I'll take 10 million Chinese a year if you'll take 10,000 American journalists.
Thank you all. You could tell how wonderfully